Hello and welcome to the Sustainable Solutions webinar series, brought to you by the Master of Science in Energy Policy and Climate program, the Master of Science in Environmental Sciences and Policy program, and the Johns Hopkins University Office of Advanced Academic Programs. Today's event features a discussion with Adriana Martinez on border fence and buoy impact on river processes at Eagle Pass, Texas. My name is Peter Huggins, and I'm the event producer. Please note today's event will be recorded and uploaded to the AAP YouTube channel under the Sustainable Solutions playlist. During the program, if you have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A function as well as the chat, and we'll answer as many questions as possible during the latter portion of the event. With that, I will turn over the presentation to our moderator, Dr. Cassie Hansen, Program Director and Senior Lecturer for the Master of Science in Environmental Sciences and Policy program.
Thank you, Peter, and good evening, good afternoon, everyone. It's so nice to see familiar names on the attendee list. We are so pleased to have you here today. And as you know, I'm the Director for Environmental Sciences and Policy, and I'm joined today by my wonderful colleagues, Dr. Rachel Isaacs and Dr. Lama El Hato, who are the hosts of this year's Sustainable Solutions Speaker Series. As you have already been briefed on, this sustainable series is sponsored by the Environmental Sciences and Policy program, as well as the Energy Policy and Climate program at Johns Hopkins. And for those of you who are just joining us, the goal for this speaker series is to bring amazing, innovative speakers each month where we can sit down and hear how they're solving and tackling the wicked environmental, energy, and climate problems. So each month we sit down with these innovative speakers to share how they're leveraging technology, policy, the private sector, research, and field work to form innovative and lasting solutions. From water insecurity to climate adaptation, from the natural resource conflicts to energy transitions, and food insecurities to sustainable agriculture. This series features the depth and breadth of Johns Hopkins University faculty, as well as the greater community as they work together for a sustainable future. As Peter mentioned, we will give voice to your questions at the end of this presentation. But before I hand it over to the host tonight, Dr. Rachel Isaacs, it would be wonderful to see where you are joining us from tonight. So if you could go ahead and locate the chat box and share with us the state in which you're joining us, that would be wonderful for us to see the geographic extent of our audience. Georgia, Kentucky, New Mexico, excellent, Texas, Maryland, Virginia, Nevada. Oh, it's so great to see everyone here. I need to have someone from California before we get started, just to make sure we can do coast to coast. Maybe we'll get someone from Alaska. Great. Well, it's so wonderful to have you all here. And with that said, I'm going to turn this wonderful evening over to Dr. Rachel Isaacs.
Hi, everybody, and welcome. My name is Rachel Isaacs. I am the program coordinator for the ESP and GIS programs. I will do a short intro for Dr. Martinez, explain some of her background, and then she will get started. So with that, Dr. Adriana Martinez is a professor at Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville, with a joint appointment in the Department of Geography and GIS and the Department of Environmental Science. She received her bachelor's in environmental geoscience and master's degree in geography with a specialty in fluvial geomorphology from Texas A&M University, and then received a PhD in geography from the University of Oregon. She studies human impacts on rivers, in addition to her efforts to increase diversity and inclusion in STEM disciplines. She previously served as an AGU Landing Academy National Fellow, aiming to increase the recruitment and retention of faculty and staff of color. Dr. Martinez is also on the board of the American Association of Geographers and serves on the association's JEDI committee, and has led and co-led multiple grants to increase diversity in geosciences. Her work in geography delves into the branches of physical, human, and technical with her use of modeling, GIS, and drones in her fluvial geomorphology research. Her current work examines the impacts of the US-Mexico border fence on the Rio Grande River. Dr. Martinez has been interviewed by numerous outlets such as Scientific American, BBC, CNN, and Spectrum News on her work on the border. She also is currently getting interviewed by the Washington Post on the same work. Today, she'll be speaking about the impacts of buoys installed in Eagle Pass, Texas in July of 2023. And with that, I will pass this over to Adriana. Dr. Martinez.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully you can see that now. Thanks for having me today. As Dr. Isaacs mentioned, I'm going to talk about border militarization, and this is actually in my hometown of Eagle Pass, Texas. So I know quite a lot about the area. So I've done different iterations of this study from starting in about 2008. I actually started looking at how the border fence is impacting river flow up on the floodplain when floods happen. But more recently, I've looked at the impact of the buoys that were placed in the Rio Grande at Eagle Pass. And you may be familiar with this based on some national news stories that happened. And this happened, of course, in my hometown of Eagle Pass. And so I'll be speaking about both of these sides of the story, less so about the border fence and more about the buoys, which is the work that I have ongoing right now. So for a little bit of context to get us situated here, from about 2008 to 2009, a large swath of construction along the US-Mexico border began. And this resulted over multiple years in approximately 1,000 kilometers of fencing that was built along the US-Mexico border. Much of that fencing takes the form of this fence that's shown up here. It's what's called the aesthetic style fencing built by the federal government. This fence, all these fence sections are at Eagle Pass. And approximately 190 kilometers of that fence in 59 or over 59 segments was built along the Rio Grande, and then other fence sections built on land not near a water source. And the Real ID Act of 2005 and the Secure Fence Act of 2006 really allowed for the construction of these fence sections such that all environmental laws that are typically required of this type of construction were waived. And so things like, the Migratory Bird Treaties Act or like Native American Burial Sites Acts, we really didn't have to abide by those based on this construction because they deemed that they wanted this construction to happen quickly. Since then, that was sort of the federal fence sections. There have been large sections of fence added by the state of Texas under Governor Greg Abbott. And that is what is seen in the bottom 3 pictures here. And so we have different styles of that. This is what is more similar to that aesthetic style fencing. This is all above ground, unlike the federal fence, which went like 6 feet underground, depending on where we're talking about. This is all above ground. And then we also have empty containers along the banks directly by the channel. And then we have various formations of concertina wire fencing. In this case, 2 rows stood on top of each other with fence posts holding that up. And so I'll talk a little bit about these different types of fences that exist in different parts. But the difference between that state fencing, both the containers and the concertina wire, is that they are much closer to the actual river channel, whereas the federal fence sections were really way up on the floodplain. And this is a map that shows you an example of that at Eagle Pass. And so this is actually turned on its side. So north is on the right side of this map and south is on the bottom side. The river actually runs from north to south almost directly at Eagle Pass. And Eagle Pass is obviously here on the US side. Piedras Negras is the Mexican town that is our sister city. We have a couple of things happening here. So we have international bridges that are happening here. So this is International Bridge number 1. We have International Bridge number 2 and a railroad bridge. And as I mentioned before, we have federal fence sections that were added much longer ago. So that's the black line here. One thing you'll notice is that this fence is in sections. And so a lot of times they left gaps in the fence to be able to access the other side of the land that was on the floodplain. So a lot of times these are the width of like a lane, right? Or 2-car lane where the road exists. And then we also have the state fencing, which is outlined here in white, that was added much later. This is the brown line here is outlining where those empty containers are. And those empty containers are pretty mobile. And so they do tend to add and subtract those at varying times. This is just one time period when I was mapping this out. And then most recently in July of 2023, they added in a 1,000-foot long line of buoys, and they are located downstream of town right here. And so I really came about this work really because, right, I'm a fluvial geomorphologist. I was really interested in why they were building the fence in this location. Some of the first work that I did was looking at more of the social impacts, like do people really think that the fence is going to have an impact on deterring immigrants? But since that time, we've had multiple floods of what locals called 100-year floods. And so in 2010, 2013, and 2014, we had these really large floods that inundated portions of the fence. And you can see that in the photographs here on the left. This is the second Border Patrol station on International Bridge number 2. The fence is located right here, so a portion of it is underwater as well in this location. And then this is International Bridge 1, Bridge 2, and the Railroad Bridge. And you can see how those flood waters at those times really reached out into the floodplain and the location where the fences are. And nobody has really looked at this. Nobody had studied whether the fence would have an impact on flood flows in this area or elsewhere. And so I was really interested in examining that. So my first set of projects looked at modeling the original federal fence sections. So I modeled the fence containers and aesthetic style fencing in the picture here second. But in both of those studies, I really wanted to know to what extent are flood flows interacting with the border fence, right? Does a 2-year flood get to the border fence? Does a 5-year flood get to that point, right? Or does it take a 100-year flood to get to that point? And then I also wanted to know how depth and water velocity are being impacted based on the fence's presence. And so the way that I really went about doing this was to model using a computer river model, how the river is acting, how those floods are acting when the fence is present, and then when the fence is not present, and differencing those to examine what's going on. So in order to do that, I had some boundary conditions. This is just a little bit about the data that I used. This was all data produced within GIS that was exported and then used in my river model. I had floodplain characteristics such as like the extent of the site, which in this case you can see here, buildings that are present, the fence, of course, itself, right? I wanted to know where that is located, topography in the form of LIDAR, which is the hillshade that you're seeing there. And then I also calculated flood flows, discharge, recurrence intervals, and the water depth. This is from IBWC, the International Boundary and Water Commission, and the USGS gauging stations through a FOIA request. I calibrated that model via aerial photos from 2010 just to make sure that the flood flows that the model was showing were the ones that were actually experienced at those discharges for those different, 2, 5, 10, and so on levels. And so really quickly, I can go more into this if you have questions, but that modeling showed that the fence does cause floods to inundate more of the floodplain. And this was in minor areas, and it was about 10 meters more. So it's at certain times, at certain points, the flood would expand further into the US side. So that was interesting. I also found that we experience deeper water and faster flows in the channel when the fence is present. And what's really happening there is that the fence is acting like a levee, right? And so in this case, we just have the levee on one side, but it's causing the fence to essentially channelize the water so that the river becomes much more of like a chute than it does like a natural river that spreads out onto its floodplain. And we can sort of imagine this when we think about those empty containers along the banks, right, is just extending out the height of that bank and acting like a levee. And these deeper and faster flows are important because there are islands that are present in the middle of the channel. And so when we have those islands present, right, we can mobilize sediment on those. And I'll talk a little bit more about those islands when we get to the buoys here in a little bit. The fence, within the fence itself, it experiences shallow water, which is to be expected because it's acting like a roughness element there. And then one of the big findings, or the more surprising findings, was that the area is very likely to experience much larger flood events than those images I showed before from the 2010, 2013, 2014 floods. You know, locals I had mentioned said that they were on 100-year flow events, and it turns out that they were like 4 to 6 year flood events. They were not that big, despite being big for locals, right? We don't often see the river get that flooded. So it's much more likely that the fence is to get even more underwater, essentially, in the near future, right? If we do experience one of those bigger floods. But then, as I mentioned, last July, the state of Texas added buoys, concertina wire along the river, and they also destroyed a few islands that are on the river itself. And so I'm going to talk about this sort of in this portion and for the bulk of the talk. And I've been conducting this work more or less since November of 2023, and getting access to the river is pretty limited, and I'll talk a little bit about that. So I'm still processing that data and trying to get more data as we go out, as I kind of go out on the river. So the buoys essentially came about for various reasons. There was a lot of political turmoil in the area, because what happened was we have Shelby Park, which is a public city-owned park right along the banks of the river. That's what's shown right here. And it's just shown in this Google Earth image. There's softball fields there. This is typically where the town holds its Friendship Festival, right? So carnivals and things like that. And it's right along the banks of the river. And the mayor signed an affidavit stating that the state of Texas could arrest anyone that stepped onto Shelby Park as if it was private property. And he signed the form stating like it was essentially his private property, which is illegal. He's not allowed to do that. It is not it's not the mayor's private property. It belongs to the city, right? And all the people there. But I think that really set in motion the state being able to say what they wanted to do, right? What could go on in this location. And originally they had wanted to put the buoys in at this section of the river. So this is International Bridge number 1, right along Shelby Park. And based on what I've read, they wanted to put the string of buoys here, but they were not able to do that because if the buoys became dislodged in some way, they could mess with the bridge piers and cause damage to the bridge piers, which would obviously be devastating for commerce, right? And international travel. But this sort of underlying this whole issue is that we have Shelby Park. This is a public park that we almost pretty much don't have access to anymore. If you go to Shelby Park, there are gates meeting you, and you can't get past that point to get close to the river. And when they put these buoys in, they did a lot of things to try to help in apprehending immigrants that were crossing. And so there's a series of about 4 or 5 islands in the river from about Shelby Park down to about where the buoys are, like a mile and a half downstream. And they removed vegetation from all those islands. This is because they wanted to be able to see any immigrants that might stop on an island while they're crossing the river. So this is an image from Google Earth looking from the upstream towards downstream. And this is an island located right off of Shelby Park. And by definition, right, the island is separate from the main bank. And they completely connected it back to the main bank. And so they, removed all the vegetation and then connected it, right, filled in that channel that was on the side. And so this is a satellite image obtained from some colleagues at the University of Delaware for me. And this is what that looks like now, right? The island is now connected back and it's bare of vegetation. And you'll remember that I stated before that flows are likely to be stronger with the presence of the fence, right? And so now what we have is a bare island that when flood flows go through there, nothing's holding that sediment down, right? And so that is very likely to be mobilized whenever we do experience floods, and that could be a water quality issue. And before I talk specifically about my buoy work, I wanted to talk a little bit about the nature of this field work. It's really interesting. It's unlike any other fieldwork I've ever done. I've been on rivers for 20 years studying them. I know a lot of people that study rivers. It's never been so hard to get on a river, to take samples, to take measurements as it has on this river, which is disheartening because it's my home river, right? It's the river that I grew up on. It's the river that I first went out and I started doing science on. It's where my high school teacher took me to do water quality testing when I was a senior. So this is a picture of me and a field assistant in November of 2023. And there were a lot of migrants crossing at that particular time. So we were on the river for a couple of hours collecting samples, releasing some dye, and we probably saw about 24 or more migrants crossing at that point. And this is where the buoys begin, and then they go 1,000 feet downstream to the left of the screen. And so this is just happens to be a shallow part of that portion of the river. And so they're crossing at that particular spot. And they were just continually crossing at that time of the year. When I went in July of 2024, I was able to get Texas DPS to escort me and allow me to do the work. This time we went on 2 airboats escorted by, I think it was like 6 or 7 DPS agents, which was very interesting. These are my 2 field assistants, Abby and Randy Lawrence, who was my high school teacher in that AP environmental science class where we went out on the river. And so we were able to do some sampling there. At that time, there were no migrants. We didn't see a single migrant then. And it's pretty much that way now. There aren't many migrants crossing at that point. And so here is some drone footage of what the buoys look like in November of 2023. And so this is footage looking upstream. And so the left side of the screen is the Mexican side. So you'll see that that is vegetated, right? Natural channel, desert, shrub that we see. And then on the right side, you'll see some concertina wire fences, right? Bare soil, mostly devoid of vegetation, a road built for Border Patrol and Texas DPS. And as we move upstream here, you'll see large concrete blocks. Those are put in place and cables are attached to them that are then attached to the buoys to hold the buoys in place. You'll see some debris, right? Branches, trees, things like that stuck against the buoys. The water was a little deep at this point. It wasn't too shallow, and yet the buoys are not really floating, right? They're kind of sitting on top of this river bar. And this is the second location that the buoys were placed in. The buoys were originally placed closer to the middle of the channel, but Mexico complained and said that they were on their side of the river. And so the state of Texas did have to come through and move them onto this river bar that already existed in that location. This is a video of the buoys from that same vantage point in July of 2024. So at this point, the buoys had been in place for a full year. We are still on top of that bar, so you can sort of see that the buoys are on a shallow spot, particularly right here. And now we have a lot of vegetation growing there. The green on the far right is some dye that I released to look at flows, so you don't have to pay too much attention to that, but we're seeing willows, right? There's baby willows growing in there, grasses, sedges, right? This bar is essentially becoming an island because we have that bar growing over time. And the reason that's really happening is because it's a bar already, right? And so it's a shallower area to begin with, but the buoys are slowing down water in that location because they're acting like a roughness element. They're acting like a string of boulders that's routing water around them. And so I'm really interested in how flow is moving through the buoys and how the buoys are acting at different flow levels. And so on the top left here, we'll see a video where we can see some sections when the water is low where the buoys are channeling water between the balls themselves. And it's such that it's creating small little channels along the buoys going downstream. And so you can see that flow from the main portion of the channel, from the Mexican side, essentially into the US side here. And that's shown here as well too. This is another picture looking from upstream to downstream, the US on the left side. You can sort of see the striations in the surface of the water here, showing that, right, we have some water moving through the buoys and going in this direction. The same sort of thing happening in this image on the right. We see some water flow happening from the buoys on the Mexican side over here towards the US side. But for the most part, right, other than those smaller channels, the buoys are serving as a roughness element, and they're slowing down water when that wouldn't be happening were they not present. So one of the things I did was a dye release, and this was a dye release in November when the water was a little higher. And the thing I want you to notice here is this green that's close to the buoys. That dye was released on the Mexican side of the river, and it is flowing through the buoys into the US side. So you can kind of see that, right, the buoys are sort of blocking that flow, and then it eventually makes its way to the US side, but it's much slower than it would have if the buoys weren't there, because again, they're blocking that flow that would normally happen. And then this is, again, another video looking from upstream to downstream. I'm going to fly downstream here. The US is on the left side, the Mexican side is on the right side, and you'll see some of those striations in the vegetation showing that the flow is kind of getting pulled, but pulled much more slowly from the US side to, or sorry, from the Mexican side to the US side as it's going down. So you can sort of see those striations. It's creating some portions where you see little channels developing in there. And then we reach the vegetation portions, right, where it's really starting to become more of like an island. We've got willows in there again, grasses, sedges, all sorts of things growing in there. My dissertation was on vegetation in rivers, so it's like really exciting for me to see plants in rivers. I just think it's really fun. And then, you know, further downstream here, we tend to see there's like the bar sort of dissipates at this point. We're kind of in deeper water in this section. And then again, you can see, right, the left bank here is devoid of vegetation that's been removed along the channel. And so I'm trying to see what the buoys look like at varying levels, as well, as I mentioned. So here I have some photos in November of 23 when the water was a little bit higher. This one on the bottom right is showing December of 28 when it was about half that or less than half of that level. And you can see that the buoys are really sitting on top of that bar that has always been there, right? But I'm arguing that that bar is developing, it's growing faster, it's becoming an island faster than it would were the buoys not to be in place there. And one of the things that the state of Texas said was that the buoys are supposed to float, right? So they're attached to these cables that are attached to those cement anchors, but they're supposed to float up whenever the water does get high. However, during the federal case, when the federal government sued the state of Texas for placing the buoys in the river, an expert stated that they don't think that the cables are long enough to actually allow the buoys to float the amount that they should the river get as high as we expect it to get from year to year. So I'm really curious, like what, you know, how mobile are those buoys going to be? And when I've been on the river, you know, and I've messed with the buoys, they're supposed to spin so that if you try to climb them, you just end up spinning round and round, right? The buoys don't stay in place, but that's not the case based on what I've found. You know, I'm not super athletic, but I could very easily climb over a buoy. It pretty much is stuck in place. And so it's fairly easy to climb. And then this is a video of some high flows. Eagle Pass experienced like 6 to 7 inches of rain over like a 2 or 3 day period in early September just this month. And so I had my trusty field assistant, my mom, go out and do some videoing of the river where the buoys are at. And the thing I want you to notice here is that, you know, it's a little hard to see, but the water is going much faster on the Mexican side than it is on the US side. This water is incredibly slow, right? And that's again, because typically the water comes from the Mexican side and sort of gets turned into the US side, but the buoys are slowing down that flow from happening. And so again, they're providing that roughness element. And so we're experiencing much slower floods or as much slower flows on the US side. And what I think is likely to happen here is that the Mexican side of the channel over here on the far end is going to get deeper over time because that's where you're experiencing more velocity. So more velocity means that the river has more power. It's going to dig into the channel there. And then on the US side, you're going to get deposition. And so that is essentially going to create that island, right? Make that bar turn into an island over long periods of time. I also did sediment sampling while I was out on the river in July. And so this is us sampling that sediment. I'm really interested in determining what sort of sediment is depositing around the buoys at different locations in the buoys, right upstream of the buoys, on the US side of the buoys and the Mexican side of the buoys. And so I tried to take various samples throughout the area. I dried those and then shipped them off. Oliver and Bear were very interested in how they smelled because they were quite smelly as I was packing them up there. And I brought them back to my lab and I've been drying them. And me and a student are processing those to see if we can determine any sediment size differences. And those sediment size differences are going to tell us what sort of velocity the channel is experiencing in those places. Because if you see big sediment, right, cobbles, pebbles, that means the water is very fast because it's picking up the small stuff and taking it away. But if you see smaller sediment samples, which is what I suspect we'll find on the buoy side or on the US side, that means that the buoys are slowing down water and small sediment is depositing in those spots. I was also really interested in vegetation and how much sediment is being deposited in the vegetation. So I took a couple of vegetation samples and looked to see, right, what sort of sediment are we seeing in those different types of vegetation. And so here's an idea of what that vegetation is. So we have some filamentous algae, things like pond scum, moss, or waternet, and then flowering pondweed, which is what you see in this photo on the left here, that has the yellow flowers. And then we do have some grasses and some sedges in there, and then again, some small baby willows that are starting to grow in those spots. And so I took the vegetation that I could. I only took a couple of samples, and I separated out the vegetation from the sediment, so I could do a cumulative sediment size distribution. This is all the data I have right now. We're still in the process of those sediment samples, but I'm excited about this. So you know, there was sediment in the moss. There's sediment in the macrophyte as well. So that more stringy type of plant algae. And so I'm going to try to compare, right? Do we see differences in what's present in the plants compared to what's not in the plants and those other samples that I took that we're still in the process of processing. I have also done some drone flight work. I flew right, you saw some of the videos, but I also took photos. And so I used a structure from image process that, structure from motion process that allows me to take, 100, 200, 300 photos from an area at all different angles and then build a model of what that area looks like and an aerial photo of what it looks like. It doesn't work super great with the drone flights that I've done because given the nature of the work and how I don't really have a ton of access, I don't have a lot of time to like set out GPS targets and like really lock in, geolocate the location of what I'm flying. But it's pretty good. It's okay. And I'm going to try to mess a little bit with the data to try to get it to be a little bit better to imagine where that where the buoys are, right? And then the growth of this bar over time. And so this is the drone imagery that I took in November of 2023. This is just the Google Earth view of what that bar looked like before the buoys were in place. And then I also have the drone image footage from July of 2023, which I have yet to process, and I'll be processing that soon. I also took drone imagery at Shelby Park, which again is like a mile upstream of where the buoys are, because when they put those empty containers along the bank, they also removed large swaths of vegetation along the bank there. And that meant that a ton of erosion has happened there, right? So nothing is holding down that sediment along the bank anymore. Usually we have an invasive cane that grows along the banks here. And when they remove that, right, it's just, the sediment is there for the taking. Whenever the flow gets high, it really just eats away at those areas. And so you end up seeing these really steep banks that are happening there. And so I took some drone imagery of that area to see if I can build a 3D model at one time period and then difference that from another time period to see if I can look and see how much erosion has happened over time. So overall, what I've noticed happening based on the couple of times that I've been out on the river, I do believe that the river bar is converting to an island over time, and that's to be expected. That's not very surprising. That's sort of what I told people when they first put the buoys out there, is that the buoys are going to cause deposition because they're slowing the water down. That high flow in early September did cover the vegetation. And so I'm really interested in seeing what impact that's going to have on that vegetation establishment. I've been keeping a close eye on the hydrograph to see if I can like get my mom to go out and take some pictures when it gets low enough so I can see what sort of where the vegetation is now. But the flow is just a little too high right now to really see what that impact is. And I hope to get back on the river in November in a couple of months. I do think that there's also a changing sediment regime happening in the area, right? I talked about how that vegetation was removed on those islands. That means that sediment is going to be mobilized in those places, and that can cause water quality issues, right? The Rio Grande is the primary water source for everyone up and down the river. And so that's pretty important. Anytime you mobilize sediment, you're going to be affecting water quality. Based on what I've seen, when I'm traipsing about the buoys, I've noticed that there's a lot of coarse grains on the upstream portion of the buoys and then fine grains on the downstream portion of the buoys. And so again, this is upstream and this is downstream, the US side here on the right. And this is really small sediment sizes. This is clay, silts that are present here. And then up at the top portion of the buoys, I'm seeing a lot more coarse pebbles and cobbles there. And then I want to see, right, does the vegetation establishment accelerate sediment deposition? And so hopefully when I go back out there, I'll be taking a lot more samples within the vegetation to see what sort of sediment we're seeing there. Then I do want to talk a little too here about the current state and future of immigration. And I mentioned that in the November, when I did fieldwork in November of 23, there was a lot of immigrants crossing, but in July of 24, there was hardly any, right? And that is a result of the Mexican government essentially stopping immigrants at their southern border and really keeping an eye on immigrants that are trying to cross into the US. And so this idea of international diplomacy, right, that's really sort of the way to fight immigration, because right in November of 23, we saw dozens and dozens of immigrants crossing, and yet there were these multiple layers of fence. And so this is the property that's located right along the buoys. This is me doing a drone flight with my trusty field assistant, my dad. This is the state aesthetic style fencing, and that is located just off of this picture here. So it's just a little bit farther off, not in the frame. So that's one layer of fence. We're standing right next to a chain link fence here. And there's a second chain link fence that's on its side here, so not standing up. We have at least 1 or 2 layers of concertina wire fencing that you can see here, right? And so that's multiple rolls of concertina wire. And then you can see the buoys on the far right. And so, right, depending on how you count that, that's 5 or 6 layers of fencing. And yet we saw immigrants crossing, right? That was not preventing immigrants from crossing. It was not preventing them from getting to the US bank. And so that's just the nature of things, right? This infrastructure just isn't working. However, those other types of policies are. But what about the buoys? It's still to be determined what exactly is going to happen with them. There is a federal case against the state of Texas. The governor was supposed to remove them, but he did appeal that. And so that is an ongoing case. The governor was on a podcast a couple of weeks ago, and he said that he wants to extend the buoys. I don't know if he means like extend the line of buoys that are at Eagle Pass, right? Make them longer than 1,000 feet, or if he wants to add buoy sections on other portions of the river, right? Like at El Paso or other places. But it cost about $1 million to buy this string of buoys. And I don't think that includes like actual construction of placing them in the river. And so that's how expensive we're talking about here. And so to be determined on whether he is going to try to move in the direction where he adds more sections or extends out this section. I'd like to thank a few people that really helped out with this research. The Eagle Pass Border Coalition is the local nonprofit that does work with immigrants and work with the river, and they've been super supportive of my work. Representative Vicki Goodwin out of Austin and Representative Eddie Morales out of Eagle Pass. He's our representative there. Were super helpful in getting me connected with Texas DPS so that I could get access to the river. It was very difficult, and I had a few times where I really was hoping to get on the river and I wasn't able to. And so they were helpful in that. Magali Urbina and the Urbinas, her husband as well, have given me access to their property so that I can take pictures, I can do drone flights. And so I'm really appreciative of that. My trusty field assistants, Randy Lawrence, Avila Luna America, and Mike Garcia were really helpful. And then my colleagues at the University of Delaware that helped me obtain some satellite imagery. So with that, I'll open it up to questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was a great talk. Wonderful. And so while people are writing their questions in the chat, I will just start to give people a little bit of time. I know we were sort of discussing before this your interview coming up and the article coming up with the Washington Post, and you had mentioned that there were differences in water levels and discharges between two of the locations, Eagle Pass and El Paso, and also what sort of deaths they were causing, or no deaths. So can you talk about what are some of the differences between the two locations and what you're observing?
Yeah, and so I'm super familiar with the river at Eagle Pass, obviously having grown up there, and I'm less familiar with that in El Paso, but we're thinking, right, like, there's they have data on drownings that have occurred, and it's really interesting, right, and also horrific to be thinking about, like, okay, well, why are these drownings happening, right? And so what are the reasons behind that? Does it have to do with the river level? Does it have to do with the form of the river in that location? So like in El Paso, the river is much flatter. It's channelized. A lot of places it has a concrete bottom and sides, right? And so it's maybe a lot simpler than some places. And then in Eagle Pass, it's a lot more complex, right? It's much more of a natural river in that spot. And so looking at, right, those conditions, is it the geomorphology of the river? Is it the flow of the river itself? Or is it the infrastructure, right? As having these fence sections, right, the concertina wire, has that played a role in how dangerous the river can be? And I can say that, right, when I float down the river, when I've done the work, you can see balls of concertina wire in different sections of the river. So they just tangled mess, right? It's essentially trash that got loose from the bank and now it's in the middle of the river, right? And so those all create dangerous conditions for immigrants. And it's much like, right, a lot of the word around when the fence first went in, decades ago, was, right, this is going to cause more danger for immigrants. It's going to mean that they go to more remote locations to try to cross the river, right? And so it does increase danger in that sense.
Question from the chat, Penny. What type of aquatic life is found in the river? And although your focus is on the fluvial geomorphology of the river, can you also speak to the negative effects to fish, birds, etc., due to the buoys?
Yeah,
so
absolutely. Yeah. So I'm definitely not an aquatic biologist. But anytime, like I said, right, when you're moving sediment, like you're destroying those islands, right, that creates murkier waters, which means like photosynthesis is less likely to take place like it did before because the sun can't get through the water column. So that might affect plants, which can affect the food chain. For different fish, right? I imagine fish are getting caught in concertina wire that's stuck in there. I've heard the legends of things growing up, right? We have alligator gar and fish, fairly big fish. There is an alligator that lives in the channel there. They say there's two. They, Border Patrol and DPS see him splashing about. There's like a bigger one and a smaller one. And so that's even something I talked to a fish and wildlife person when I was on the river in July. And I was like, are y'all going to remove the alligator? Like, what's the story there? Like, it doesn't belong there. But we think it got released by somebody that had alligators in a pond upstream. And they said, like, no, the alligator's happy. Like, he's just going to stay in there, you know? So yeah, so there's a lot of different species there. I imagine that, like, the sediment, to answer your question, is can affect the food chain and things like that. They can get caught in different areas. There is one story in terms of the fence in the Rio Grande Valley. So further downstream from where we are at, there was a fire, and most of the time, right, critters would run to the river to escape the fire. And they found a lot of critters dead along the fence line because they were not able to escape that fire, right? And so it changes migration patterns. And we knew that that would happen, and the fire is an extreme example of that.
Yikes.
Yeah.
From Christy, how do you maintain your objectivity in a study like this when the environmental damage is politically driven and absolutely avoidable?
Yeah, I mean, I think I can't, right? But I do try to make sure that the science speaks for itself. You know, and on one hand, it's a very emotional topic. It's not one that I by any means want to be doing. I wish I didn't have to tell this story. I didn't have to do this work. This is the most emotional research I've done, right? There's one reason why I do physical geography. It's because I don't have to, you know, talk to people and hear their hard stories, and this is requiring that. So on the one hand, right, I'm just going to let the science speak for itself, let the evidence speak for itself, you know, and let, like, photos and measurements that I take speak for itself. But I think it's also a really good opportunity for me to tell a story for a place that's not often heard from, and from experts that are not often located in that place, right? There aren't many people from the border that study rivers like I do. And so I find that it's my responsibility to tell that story and to tell it with that science lens to really be able to back up what it is that I'm saying. But it's incredibly hard, right? When I was on the river in November, we were talking to immigrants, right? And one guy was like, can we borrow your boat? My wife is on the other side and she's really scared about crossing. And I just had to say, no, I can't, like, this is my job. That's a federal offense, right? I'd get at least 10 years if I did that. And he understood, right? But it's heartbreaking to be on the river when that's happening.
Can't imagine.
No.
Do you hope to have an impact on political decision making with your findings?
I hope so. Yeah. I try to speak to media. I try to do talks like this, right, so that people do hear that. More than anything, I just want them to know that the work is out there and that local people think that this is wrong and it's not okay that this is happening. And oftentimes we'll get decisions, right, from Washington, D.C., or in this case, Austin, that don't really understand the border area. So ultimately, yeah, it'd be nice if it could make some sort of impact. And I do talk a lot to local elected officials. I've spoken at city council multiple times, right? I talk to Representative Eddie Morales and Representative Vicki Goodwin and speak to them, right? And they're willing to listen to me and they're willing to support that work and they want to understand what's happening. So I've definitely received positive feedback in that sense.
It's policy-wise, this is really complicated when you're dealing with, you know, Mexican government policy versus US policy. And so do you also talk to people on the Mexican side, and how do you see the differences in policy or the clashing of the two kind of entities at that point when you're putting in something like the buoys and you're creating islands and changing flow? What, you know, does that, what, you know, how does that interaction sort of come out in
Yeah. Yeah, and so I do want to do a lot more of that interaction, but Mexico, at least the way I've seen it, is they've stayed fairly quiet. They have said sort of on a national level, like, hey, we didn't like that. We didn't like that you put them on our side, you know. But like, at least locally, like the Mexican consulate, I've spoken to some people there and I want to reach out to a few more people, but they've been like, oh yeah, no, we don't like the buoys. Like, that's not okay that they're doing that, you know, but they're not necessarily stepping out and saying that. I think maybe perhaps this is just me speculating. They want it to play out in the federal courts, for example. But it is like, it's a treaty issue. So there's at least 2 treaties that state that we cannot change the flow by a certain amount. It's like a certain percentage of the depth on the Mexican side by doing anything on the US side, right? And so when we put in those federal fence sections, they modeled what would happen first before they decided to place the fence way up on the floodplain. The Texas state government didn't do that when they put the containers in. They didn't do that when they put the buoys in, right? And so it's very likely that it's changing flow on the Mexican side enough that it violates those two treaties. And so it's a really interesting story. And this is a water source that we share, right? Mexico is supposed to get a certain portion and we're supposed to get a certain portion. And so it's in our best interest to maintain these relationships.
So that means you're also seeing a difference in policy between the federal US government, the state, and the city and county, maybe even?
It's very complicated, and it depends on who you talk to for sure.
Do you notice a lot of different fence types? Do you notice different impacts to the rivers with the different fence types?
So I'm sure there are, but unfortunately the models that exist don't allow me to differentiate at the scale needed. So for example, like one limitation of the model is that you can place the fence, but it has to be an impenetrable, right, impermeable barrier, which it's not, right? Even the containers themselves have gaps between the containers. The containers are empty. So in theory, they would fill with water, for example. But we don't have river models that will allow for that level of detail. So I'm not able to model that, but I imagine that absolutely there would be differences based on the types.
Do you know how they came up with the 1,000-foot length for the buoys?
No, it's just a round number. I don't know. I've counted them a couple of times. I think like it's hard to count them from my like drone footage, but there's like 257 of them. It's a little over 250. I have no idea. Maybe it was a money thing, right? They just said we'll throw $1 million at it. I'm not really sure. And I think they were developed in the Middle East. And then brought over here. And then the buoys, right? You have the buoy balls, which I always thought of as like giant yoga balls, but they're much thicker, much heftier, much bigger than yoga balls. But that's kind of what you can sort of imagine. And then between them, there are razor blades, almost like circular saw razor blades. They're not as sharp as that, but they do exist, razor blades in between each ball. And that is, again, to deter people from trying to climb them, thinking that they'll get cut on those. And then there's supposed to also be wire fencing underneath them so that you can't swim under the buoys, but they're touching the ground. And I have not ever seen evidence of that fence that's supposed to be there. So, yeah, it's just a whole hodgepodge of like cruel.
Yeah. They removed islands and devegetated the islands, removed the channels. Now the islands are building on the buoys and they know that the buoys aren't very effective. Are there any plans in place? Are you aware of any plans in place to remove those buoys?
To remove them? No, not that I know of. Yeah. I think that the state of Texas will keep them there. I imagine that if the buoys undergo some sort of damage, right, one of them breaks or something like that, they do have replacement buoys waiting at Shelby Park to repair them. But to my knowledge, they haven't gone back in the channel to do any sort of maintenance, though they were supposed to do maintenance, and a couple of the San Antonio news stations were trying to follow up because the state of Texas said, like, we've done maintenance and we've done inspections of the buoys, and there's really no evidence to say that.
With the blocking off by the city, the mayor of Shelby Park from a public access place, what are there any plans in place to remedy that situation?
So it was really interesting, and I was actually involved in this a little bit because I spoke at city council when Shelby Park sort of was first taken over by the state. And so there was a big public outcry from citizens of Eagle Pass. You know, a bunch of us showed up at the city council meeting saying, hey, you can't do this. The city council members went into a private session and they came out and said, okay, you're right, we'll rescind this. You know, the mayor really shouldn't have signed that. And so they did, they rescinded it, and we had a little bit more access to Shelby Park since then, or right after that. But since then, the state of Texas has just close down Shelby Park again. And so like, it's really hard to imagine, right? But just imagine if you have a park in your neighborhood and suddenly giant fences go up all the way around it, and there is a gate that like opens and closes, and you have armed National Guardsmen and armed DPS agents standing at the gate now. Right. And this is the gate that you go into to go play softball, that you used to go into to go to the carnival. Right now, suddenly that's gone. Right. That's the one place we have a boat ramp in town. So if you want to put a boat in, there's nowhere to put a boat in the river because it's either covered in concertina wire or Shelby Park access has been blocked. So the city wants people to have access to it, and they did make a statement that's like, oh, we shouldn't have done that, let's give it back. And it was for a little while, and sort of like it was a big victory for us, for the Eagle Pass Border Coalition. But since then, it's probably even worse now. We just don't have any access, and that's due to the state of Texas. And it'll sometimes change. Like, really, there's, growing up, Border Patrol had a huge presence, but now it's primarily National Guard and Texas DPS that has a presence at Shelby Park. And so if you go to those gates, that's who you have to interact with. When I get access to go on the river, that's who I have to interact with. Right? It means getting off the car before you go through the gate. It means showing them your ID, right? Then you're able to get into Shelby Park, right? There's a lot of military vehicles and that sort of thing.
And I think we have time for maybe one more question, maybe two. If in terms of, you mentioned water quality or effects of water quality, and I guess you talked about the suspended sediment. Are you also noticing any sort of increases in pollutants, and particularly on the US side with the reduced flow?
I have not seen any, because I'm not really measuring that. But anytime you get sediment moving, the pollutants are really trapped in the sediment, right? And so anytime you're moving sediment, you're going to mobilize pollutants in the water. And so when we have vegetation, right, that keeps sediment down. It's not getting mobilized unless it's a really high flow or that vegetation gets ripped out by a flood. But anytime you're moving that sediment, that's when you release pollutants into the water. And so it's likely that you would, but I wouldn't necessarily see it just happening on the US side, right? The pollutants are going to be released on the whole width of the channel. And so I think you'll see that everywhere. One thing you might see is sort of more standing water on the US side, like where the buoys are at, and then you get more vegetation growing, right? And so when I talk to like the property owners there, they really don't like that. And when the water gets low, the vegetation starts rotting and it smells, right? And it's not really pleasant when they used to have sort of this nice riverfront property. So it can be a nuisance in that sense too.
Okay. And I think we have one more time for one more question. The sharp abrasive optics between the buoys brings up an interesting aspect regarding microplastics. What are your thoughts on how this could become a U.S. environmental public health issue due to water quality impacts that could potentially result in the removal of buoys?
I mean, I wish that would result in the removal of the buoys. But I just don't have much faith in logical reasons to remove them, right? It would take examining how that might impact microplastics. I do know there's like pieces of rubber and things that were at one point covering the blades that are kind of just hanging on now. Those could be released into the water. I just at this point I don't have a lot of faith in like what could maybe get them to take it out, right? If they're not going to take it out because of it's an international issue, like they're not gonna take it out because it's destroying the river or because it's harming human life, right? Unfortunately.
As we wrap up, I know there's some more questions. Would you be okay with people emailing you questions?
Yes, absolutely. Please email me. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you everybody for attending. Thank you so much, everybody. Round of applause for Dr. Martinez. This was a wonderful presentation, wonderful talk. And then I want to remind everybody there will be another symposium later in October. We'll send out all the details, as well as a GIS After Dark that's scheduled for October 3rd at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time with the National Geographic Chief Cartographer. So let us know if you have any questions, and if you want us to send any more information her way or ask any more questions, you can feel free to email. And thank you everybody for attending.
Thank you.